Thank you all for being here tonight, and thank you all for your patience. Tonight's talk is Montane birds and their habitats in the Great Basin. And our speaker is going to be Dr. Frank Fogarty. Dr. Fogarty is currently an assistant professor of applied avian ecology at Cal Poly Humboldt, formerly Humboldt State. His graduate students work on a variety of projects, including snowy plover predator behavior and ecology, Lewis's woodpecker conservation and management, and strategies for maximizing bird diversity in active timberlands. Frank's most extensive experience comes from his work on bird communities in the mountains of the Great Basin, which was the topic of his doctoral research at UC Davis. So thank you all for being here, and please welcome Dr. Frank Fogarty.
Great, thanks so much, Ken. Can you hear me okay?
Hope you can hear that applause. Okay.
Cool, y'all are able to hear me all right?
Yeah, you're ready to share.
All right, cool. Let me just share my screen. And can you see that okay?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Well, thanks so much, Ken, for the invite, and I appreciate being the guinea pig for the first hybrid meeting. I wish I could be back in Davis. It's been a few years since I've been down there, but I'm excited to talk to you all about some work, as Ken mentioned, about birds in riparian systems in the Great Basin and their habitat. So I will go ahead and get started. So I see some familiar names and faces on the cameras there, but I can tell you a little bit about how I got to where I'm at and what I was doing for this work. I was lucky to start working in the Great Basin in 2013, collecting point count data and vegetation data in the mountains of central Nevada. I'll talk a little bit more about them later on. And that's how I ended up in Davis ultimately. That led me to doing my PhD work at University of California in Davis, where I kept working on that system and collecting data both from the central Great Basin and then from a whole bunch of other sites around the Great Basin, including some in California. And that became the main thrust of my dissertation, as Ken mentioned. And then I'm now currently up at Cal Poly Humboldt, what we used to call Humboldt State. I'm now getting the name right, I think, most of the time, where I'm an assistant professor and have broadened my interest. So I'm not just working on the Great Basin anymore, which is kind of weird to think about. I thought of myself as really primarily a Great Basin person, but I'm still really fascinated by the system, and I'm actively involved in a few collaborations there and hoping to get some more stuff off the ground there. This is a picture from one of my study sites here, and one of the many tents that I used and broke some of while I was doing field work out there. If you're not familiar, I've said the word Great Basin a few times. It's this huge area of the Intermountain West. It's almost a 500,000 square kilometers. It's dry. Much of it you could consider to be a desert by its rainfall amounts. A little bit around the edges and at higher elevations is enough rain. It doesn't quite meet the threshold of being a desert, but it's a really arid area overall. So quite dry and really defined by this what we call basin and range topography. So it's got all these north-south mountain ranges. You can sort of see that a little bit if you look closely at this image here. And I'm going to be talking a lot about some of those mountain ranges in the center of the Great Basin. There's a bunch of different ways to define what the Great Basin actually is, depending on your interests. I usually think of it in terms of vegetation and bird communities. So kind of from the Sierra Nevada on the west edge up to the Columbia Plateau there at the top, maybe a little bit of Oregon, over the Wasatch Range in Utah. And I'm not really thinking about the Mojave Desert for this work that we're talking about, really thinking about these higher elevation areas. Even the valley floors are 4,000 or 5,000 feet elevation in most cases. And Great Basin's got about 140 species of breeding birds. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Breeding land birds, and a lot of them that are associated with riparian areas. So that word's in my talk, or in my talk title as well. Should probably make sure I also give that a definition. So if you're not familiar, riparian just refers to areas adjacent to or influenced by flowing water. So that can include springs, creeks, rivers. We don't usually include lakes or oceans or bays there, but any kind of flowing water. And usually we're defining it by its vegetation. So the vegetation that is around those riparian areas that is relatively unique, and especially in an arid system like the Great Basin, that is quite stark. As you can see kind of here in this image, behind the road here, there's lots of greener vegetation. This taller stuff is willow there. And then if you just get a meter or two in elevation upslope from there, it looks really different. It gets much drier. You have sporadic shrubs. And so this is a very distinctive habitat that's influenced by water in this otherwise arid, dry area. So what's so special about that? Why are we talking about the Great Basin? I think somebody might be unmuted. I'm not sure. I was hearing a little bit of bumping around. So you might be aware if you spend any time in the Great Basin, it's a really arid area. This is a tiny fraction of the total landscape. It's way less than 1% of the whole Great Basin is riparian. So it's a tiny, tiny area. But as I said, there's about 140 species of breeding land birds in the Great Basin. Despite the fact that these riparian areas are less than 1% of the total land cover, more than half of those 140 bird species are strongly associated in some way with these riparian areas. So this is a disproportionately important type of habitat in the Great Basin, despite it only taking up a very small area. And riparian areas are also interested in the Great Basin because they have a lot of natural fragmentation. So I'll talk a little bit more about fragmentation later on, but a lot of the work that's been done and questions asked and studies on fragmentation have really centered on fragmentation of habitats that are fragmented or broken up into smaller pieces by human activity. You've got an intact rainforest, it gets broken up into smaller pieces. You've got grassland that gets broken up by agriculture, humans fragmenting that stuff. And we haven't had as many studies that have looked at systems that have a lot of natural fragmentation, where a land cover type like the riparian areas in the Great Basin is naturally patchy and is in these small chunks. So that's a cool opportunity to study that in the Great Basin where this is the case. That said, I don't want to disregard the fact that humans have had detrimental impacts on the riparian areas in the Great Basin as well, especially over the last few centuries. So there's certainly a lot of human-driven anthropogenic fragmentation on top of that natural fragmentation as well. Cattle grazing has effects there. Cattle like to eat that tasty green riparian vegetation, so they can directly remove it. They can contribute to erosion and stream incision. You can see that here in this image where the stream channel is just dropped vertically, taking the water table with it, so you basically get no riparian vegetation around it. And then humans directly, by diverting water, by using water, that just means less water in the system overall. And then a variety of other things, including removal of beaver in some cases, and extirpation of beaver has led to more fragmentation of these riparian areas. But I'll come back to talking about that a little bit later on in my talk, because I haven't really mentioned birds all that much yet. So I should at least start to talk a bit about some of these riparian bird communities in the mountains in the Great Basin. One of the first things I want to point out is that there are no endemic riparian bird species to the Great Basin, meaning there aren't any species that are found nowhere else in the world. So this is not a land cover type that has any unique birds. All of these birds that I'll be talking about occur outside of the Great Basin and often in very different land cover types and very different habitats than what they use in the Great Basin. And typically these Great Basin habitats are the most fragmented that these species might be using. So I'm not going to be focusing on any specific species of conservation concern, but I'm going to make the argument that these are really unique communities as a whole. And I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about these communities and some of the things we've learned about them. So even if these species all occur elsewhere, right, you can find them outside of the Great Basin. They aren't on the endangered species list. This assemblage of birds is unique, and I think it's a valuable part of the Great Basin ecosystem. These often are species we don't associate with being a desert species. I never think of red-naped sapsucker or house wren as really being a desert species, but they're able to utilize these rather small pockets and chunks of riparian habitat in this larger arid landscape, which is a really neat thing. On top of that, these populations that live in the Great Basin and utilize these riparian areas could have some adaptations to surviving in these more fragmented habitats that could be beneficial to their species as a whole, especially if we expect to see a warmer and a drier future. The the populations that have those adaptations to live in the warmest and driest areas that they live could be beneficial. And we get a whole range of different types of birds that inhabit these riparian areas. At the kind of the far end of the spectrum, red-naped sapsucker here on the left side, they really like riparian areas with large trees. They need big trees to nest in, so you typically need canopy cover, more extensive tree cover in these riparian areas to support them. House wrens are maybe a little bit more generalist. Anywhere that there's kind of trees in riparian zones, they'll use. And then lazuli bunting might be kind of the opposite of red-naped sapsucker. They're kind of hanging out around the edges and the driest parts of the riparian in a lot of these systems, but you really don't get them away from the riparians. They kind of like to use the sort of chromiest edges of the riparian areas. So we get birds that specialize on and use different aspects of this riparian zone. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm going to be talking about Central Nevada a fair bit. This is a little inset map here for the study area that I'll mostly be focusing on. It's these 4 mountain ranges here. So they're the Shoshone on the far left, and then the Toyabe, those kind of merge at the southern end, and then the Takima Mountains, and then the Monitor Range is that far right one. They all have those black squiggles on them. Those black squiggles are the canyons that I'll be talking about some of our data from today. I do want to bring up that I am talking about the Central Great Basin today. The Great Basin is not a monolith for birds. So even just looking at this one area, although it's huge, the Great Basin, birds do different things and use different resources and use different habitats within even just different parts of the Great Basin. And if anybody's interested in that, I worked with a colleague, Martha Zillig, who also did her PhD at UC Davis on some cool work that showed that demonstrated that different parts of the Great Basin actually have these same species of birds interacting differently with the landscape. All these canyons I'm talking about today are within about 100 miles of each other, so they're not that far apart. That said, there's quite a bit of variation in the amount of riparian that is present in these canyons. And so that's going to automatically drive some variation in what we see. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. As far as the birds in these canyons, the total species pool we're looking at is about 33 species. So over 15 years that I'm talking about some data from these sites, we detected a total of 33 riparian associated species or riparian obligates, birds that really need riparian to survive. If you look down at an individual canyon, the most that we detected in a given year was one species to 17 species. So the minimum was 1 species in a canyon a year. The most was 17 out of those 33. So we see a lot of variation in how many are in individual canyons, how many species. Which then segues into kind of the first question that I want to talk about tonight, which is this question about whether or not bird communities are predictable. So I talked about the range of species that we saw from 1 single species in a canyon all the way up to 17 in a given year. But that is unfortunately also a little bit of an oversimplification there. So nature rarely likes to make things easy for us. And so I want to pause before going any further on and just ask this question about whether communities are predictable. Can we predict what species are going to be in a given spot across time, across space? So across space, meaning if we have a site where these 4 species occur, can we use that information to get at how many species are going to see in a neighboring canyon or at a different point count location a kilometer further down that canyon? And then across time as well, if we're looking at a location in 2015, if we come back in 2016 and 2018 to that same site, are we going to expect to see the same roster of bird species that are present at that location? And maybe not surprisingly, the answer to really both of those questions, are communities predictable in time and space, is not really in this system. And I'm going to show a little bit about that. But we have some results that suggest that there's a lot of variation in these communities. Maybe that makes a little bit of intuitive sense, especially thinking about communities over space. So one point to another point in a canyon or neighboring canyons in these mountain ranges. The riparian habitat's going to be different in each of those canyons a little bit. They're not going to be identical in that way. Birds don't have identical needs. And then you're also going to have some species that are more rare than other species. So maybe we expect to see those more abundant species more commonly. So something like dusky flycatcher up here on the slide is probably one of our most widespread and abundant riparian obligates in the central Great Basin. You get them just about in any riparian areas that are at least a decent size and have maybe more than a 2-meter tall vegetation or something like that. Warbling vireos are really widespread, but you got to have trees usually for them. And then you can jump over to something like western flycatcher, which is much less widespread. They seem to be a little bit more specialized on certain types of habitat, especially canyons with water birch in them. So we don't see them as frequently. And then maybe at the far end of the spectrum, black-crowned night heron is one of the rarest riparian breeders that we get in this system. We just don't get a lot of them in general. I don't know that we have a great way of predicting where they are on the landscape. They do seem to like canyons with larger trees for them to roost and nest as well. So we get a lot of variation there in who's going to be in a given community. So to better understand what's going on here, I'm going to introduce the concept of beta diversity. And so beta diversity is just this fancy ecologist term for what is the difference between two different communities or two different spots and who's there. So let's say these two little clusters of images are two spots where we're doing a census to see what bird species are present. They both have 4 species there as shown by these photos, but they're different species that are there. So just counting how many species are present in a canyon or at a location doesn't really tell us the full story about that community. You could have 10 species at 2 different sites, and those sites could share 9 of 10 or only 1 of 10. And that makes it very, very different what's present there. And so it's worthwhile to examine beta diversity, this idea of what the actual composition is and the difference. So if you look at these 2 images here, the only shared species between them is the lazuli bunting on the far left there in the left-hand one and the bottom in the right-hand one. So we could maybe say that these communities are 25% similar or something like that. And so digging a little bit further, we want to understand some of the processes behind this beta diversity that we see. Why are locations different and what birds are present there, both, again, across time at the same spot and across space? And so I'm going to just talk about 2 main processes that we were attempting to test to see what was going on here. And those are called nestedness and turnover, and I'll talk about both of them. So the first one is nestedness. And so here we've got this community of 5 that I'll talk about. So nestedness basically just suggests that there's some predictability to who's going to be present in a community. Again, like the roster of species that are there. And that's predictable depending on the size of the community. So you have some species that are present in nearly all communities, and they're really the only species present in very small communities. Maybe the most general is birds or something like that. And then as your communities get larger and have more bird species, as you move to spots where there are more species, you add additional species in predictable ways. That's the nested idea here. So in a nested system, you don't see really small communities with very different beta diversity, with very different birds that are present there. The species that are in almost every community are going to be more adaptable and generalist. That's the idea here. And you're only going to get your rarest species and your most specialized species often in the very large communities. So if we were to look at an example of that here, here's a community with 5 species. Here's another spot nearby with 4 species, and they are 4 of the same 5 species. So you've just lost that rarest species, black-crowned night heron, but there's a predictable subset there. And then the same thing when we go down to a nearby community with 3 species. Now we've lost that kind of uncommon western flycatcher there at the top. And what we're left with here is 3 of these more widespread species. So all the communities here have lazuli bunting and broad-tailed hummingbird and house wren in this case. And then as you get larger, you're adding in a predictable way. That's basically the idea of nestedness. And then the other process, the other option there, if a system's not being driven by nestedness, is that it's being driven by turnover. And turnover just lacks that pattern. You get changes in who's present in communities that aren't predictable based on the size of the community. So here's our community of 5 again. You could have a nearby community of 4 that looks like this, almost no shared species, and then a community of 3 that looks like this down here at the far right. And so what we don't see here is that you have this set of widespread species that are everywhere, We see we lose that dusky flycatcher on top and that Cassin's finch in the middle there as we get bigger, and then we actually lose the McGillivray's warbler on the bottom with the dark hood there as we move all the way over to the biggest community. So that's the idea of turnover. There isn't that pattern there in that structure to who is present based on size. If I'm doing this in person or talking to a class about this, I usually ask for a show of hands to see which one you think matters more, the nestedness or the turnover. This was a big question that we had. Because I'm here on Zoom, I'm just going to give away the punchline. Our system was disproportionately, or at least our data suggested, driven by turnover, this process here that we're looking at. So this lack of structure to these communities or lack of predictability as to who is going to be present in these communities. And I'll show you a little bit of the results surrounding that. So here, this is from a paper that colleague Jian Yen and myself and some others put out a few years ago. And what we're just looking at here is the y-axis, so the vertical is just how much of that beta diversity, that difference between communities, is explained by turnover or nestedness. And you can see here on the left side, those whisker plots are much higher up for turnover than they are for nestedness. We had a lot more of that, a lot more beta diversity being driven by turnover. And this is for spatial beta diversity. So the idea is from one site to another one nearby, what explains the differences in the communities that we see there? And it seems like more of this turnover rather than nestedness. And that works both for the point, so at a single location, and also for the entire canyon. We see it more exaggerated at the single location because things start to get a little bit more homogeneous as you scale up to a whole canyon. And then we also did this again for temporal beta diversity. So this is, in this case, again, we're not looking just at different sites, but actually at the same site over time. So this means if I survey a site in 2014 and I come back in 2016, am I going to see a difference in what's there and what seems to be driving that change? And again, we get the same results here. Turnover, that kind of random lack of structure there and lack of predictability seems to be driving the differences we see in these communities over time, rather than them being nicely nested in some predictable way. Which then begs the question of why so much turnover. So we set out to kind of see how much beta diversity was there. We found very quickly there's a lot of difference both in space and time in these communities, difficulty in predicting them, and we found a lot of turnover here. So this was a really eye-opening result for us, at least the degree of turnover that we saw in these communities. And I think it was really a new wrinkle for us in understanding birds in the Great Basin. We knew that the system wasn't totally static. It wasn't something that never changed at all, but we just didn't expect to see this much. We still don't know what's going on entirely here. We haven't done any experiments to get at what the mechanisms are, but I do have a couple potential explanations. Any good science always generates more questions than it answers. And so why do we have so much turnover at these locations? The first potential explanation is just that these are really small communities. The total number of birds is often not very large. Again, this is a really fragmented system. There's not a lot of riparian habitat. And if we're looking at what bird species are present, in some cases, just one or two individuals might be enough to be the difference between whether or not you have McGillivray's warblers or don't have McGillivray's warblers at a site. And even in some canyons, they may not have a huge population. So it's possible that just the existence or the survival of just a few individuals could really affect these results. So maybe they're really sensitive to that. Another idea is that there could be something going on here with what we sometimes refer to as founder effects and some competition there. Essentially, who gets there first to a site affects who else can get there. These riparian zones can only support so many birds. All of these riparian species are highly migratory. They're long distance migrants. And so there's probably some variation in who happens to get back to a given spot in a given year first, who survived migration to make it back that year. And it may be that whoever sets up shop first is at an advantage to defend that territory. And that may have kind of cascading effects as to who is present there. So that could be some of what's going on here. And then the one thing I think we always have to remember when we're asking any of these questions in ecology, and kind of the least satisfying one, is that in some cases, there could just be some randomness to this. It could just be luck with what's going on there. This is a harsh environment. We know annual survival is really low for these migratory land birds. We're dealing with low number of individuals overall. So maybe there's just a lot of randomness to who just happens to survive and who happens to be present at individual sites. But I do want to kind of wrap up this part though with what I think is an important takeaway from this work. And that's that the size of a community or who is present in a community at a single place in time really might not be the best indicator for the potential for what species can be present there and the actual species that use a given riparian area. This kind of throws a wrench in our ability to effectively monitor these things. If they change that much across time and across space, we have to be really careful about just using single surveys or data from just a single year to understand what these bird communities look like. Okay, so now that I've demonstrated how hard it is to monitor these bird communities and how much they can and do change in both time and space, I want to talk a little bit about riparian habitat, which I had in my title there, mentioned very quickly at the beginning of this talk, and how differences in those riparian areas might be affecting these bird communities, might be affecting who we see in these communities. So not all these riparian communities are equal. Even just looking at, again, the central Great Basin, just these 4 mountain ranges, we get differences in the size, how much riparian habitat's there, the shape of that riparian habitat, how it's configured, how it's fragmented, its condition, how much cows have chewed on it and degraded it. Elevation might play into this. We get different plant communities. Some areas might be dominated by willow, others by cottonwood and aspen, others a lot lower and mostly woods rose. So there's a ton of variables here. And that's a lot to consider and probably way too much to ever actually effectively measure and test. I'm going to keep it simple for today, and I'm going to focus primarily on 2 kind of classic ways of measuring habitat and thinking about habitat and how it affects species. And those are area and fragmentation. So area is pretty straightforward. That's just how much of a land cover, how much of a habitat type there is. In this case, we're looking at individual canyons in the mountains and talking about how much riparian is there in square kilometers or square hectares, how much is present. And then fragmentation is just how broken up, how dispersed, how patchy that habitat is. If it has low fragmentation, it's all in one big continuous block, maybe a few big blocks. If it's really highly fragmented, it's broken into a bunch of tiny pieces or long and thin pieces, so lots of edge there. These are the 2 main measures I'm going to talk about. And there's a reason there. These are measures that we've used for a long time in ecology, and there's a lot of, now at this point, classic theory around these. It's been around for 70 plus years. And the big idea there is that the more habitat you have, the more species you have. That's probably kind of a no-brainer and pretty intuitive there, but it's been supported by a lot of data. And then the idea that as habitat gets more fragmented, for a given amount of habitat, the difference between one big block and breaking up into a bunch of smaller pieces, that fragmentation is going to decrease species richness. So richness goes up with habitat area and goes down with fragmentation. However, there's a recent challenge to this, although now it's 10 years old, which makes me feel a little old. I remember when this was the kind of crazy new idea that was out there when Lenore Farrig proposed this. But this idea that everybody's been wrong basically for half a century, and that fragmentation really doesn't matter at all. It's just the amount of habitat, and fragmentation really doesn't affect the amount of species, or if anything, it has a positive effect on species. And I won't get too much into the math or the explanation for the theory of why this works, but the basic idea is that everybody who's been measuring fragmentation and looking at how it affects species richness has been doing it wrong. And in particular, they've been using measures of fragmentation that are highly correlated with habitat area. And so they've not been able to successfully disentangle the effects of those 2 things and actually use an independent measure of fragmentation. And when they do that, at least according to this theory, they're going to find that fragmentation doesn't matter. So we were interested in kind of examining these 2 theories there, and also just thinking about how riparian area and how fragmentation affects our bird communities in the Great Basin. And just to give you a top-down view of what this looks like, here's an aerial image. This is from what we call NAPE imagery. This is a satellite product that you can get, or sorry, no, this is from aircraft, aircraft photographs. And so this is Barrett Canyon in the Shoshone Mountains. This blue kind of squiggly line there is roughly sort of the boundary of the canyon. And then I have hand delineated all of the riparian areas in that canyon. This was a bunch of tedious work. Here, I've just got them colored pink so that you can see them. They're not actually pink. But a couple big obvious things here looking at this. Again, riparian area is a small percentage of the total landscape. So there's not a lot of area here. Even canyons with a lot of riparian, it's still the minority of the landscape. And then it's quite fragmented. We get variation in how fragmented it is, but this is what fragmentation looks like. You've got that riparian area broken into chunks. Those chunks often are also long and skinny and weird shapes, increasing their edge area. There's various distances between the patches as well on the landscape. So we get variation in that between canyons. I just wanted you to see what one of these looks like. And so we wanted to know, are the size of riparian communities in canyons affected by either of those factors there? Does the amount of riparian habitat and does how fragmented it is affect how many bird species we see? We're looking at a place like Stewart Canyon here in this photo. How do those measures tell us something about these communities? So we had two really interesting results, or I think really interesting results there. The first one I'll just talk through with this plot here. Basically, we found that only habitat area affects and is an important predictor of species richness. The fragmentation didn't matter. And the way that you just read this plot here is those little horizontal lines with the dots in the middle, if they don't cross that dashed line at 0 there, that dashed vertical line, if they're all the way to the right of it or all the way to the left of it, that means they're important. And to the right means they have a positive effect, and to the left means they don't. So the only two that don't cross that line are the intercept and woody riparian area here. I should have taken the intercept off here. All that means is that we're confident that there were birds and there were a positive number of birds. Great, that wasn't something we really needed to test. But the woody riparian one there, we split out woody riparian, so shrubs and trees, versus wet meadow, so forbs and grasses. And so woody riparian had a substantial positive effect on the size of communities. You can see that parameters way off to the right there. It's not overlapping 0 at all. And then our measure of fragmentation that we use is called NLSI. So that's the fourth one down there. And it's overlapping 0. It doesn't look like it actually is an important predictor at all of the size of these communities. NLSI is basically a metric that is independent of areas. So we followed Lenore Farrick's advice. We made sure we didn't screw up there. And we used a measurement of fragmentation that doesn't correlate with area, that isn't just another way of showing area. And we found no effects there at all. So interesting that it really seemed like that habitat amount hypothesis was kind of true in our system there, that it really is just the amount of habitat that matters. I do want to point out one important caveat here, though, that the processes, both natural and anthropogenic, that cause the loss of riparian area and the things that cause increases in fragmentation are often intertwined. In fact, it's sometimes hard to reduce the amount of riparian you have without also increasing fragmentation. So I don't think we can completely disregard fragmentation, especially because the two often go hand in hand. But I think this is an interesting result that fragmentation in and of itself doesn't seem to be a predictor of the size of these communities. There also can be some tipping points here. As you get to really small and highly fragmented patches of riparian, those patches might be at higher risk of disappearing altogether in canyons. And so as we get warmer, as we get drier in the future, there could be some tipping points there where we get a lot of fragmentation and start to lose riparian entirely, which would be a bad thing for birds that use them. Okay, so that was our first really interesting finding I wanted to share. And then the second one here I'm using this other plot for is that we get this kind of strong inflection point, or maybe think of it as a tipping point there, when we're thinking about species richness in these canyons and the amount of woody riparian area. So our smallest canyons, our canyons with the smallest amount of riparian, had less than 1 hectare, really not much at all riparian, so pretty close to 0 down there. And our largest were around 100 hectares. So that's about the range of variation that we saw in riparian vegetation. And this here is the model predictions for how many species we get in a canyon with a given amount of woody riparian. And so you can see it goes up really quickly. There's a big effect at the low end there. But by the time we get to 25, 30 hectares of woody riparian, kind of about an average canyon in our study system, we're pretty much plateaued. Our model suggests that it's capable of sustaining about the maximum, about the full community there. And so if we're interested in managing for sites that contain species richness, that have a lot of species, we should be maybe thinking about the total amount of habitat and not so much about its configuration and how fragmented it is, but just how much there is in total. And maybe we should be focusing on these moderate size to smaller riparian canyons as the ones that we might want to think about doing any kind of work to make sure they don't lose any more riparian or even increasing the riparian that's there. Because if you have a canyon that's got 24 hectares of woody riparian, even just losing a little bit of that 10–20% of that habitat looks like you're going to pretty substantially start to lose species and the ability of that habitat to support large communities. Whereas if you're much larger, if you've got an 80-hectare riparian canyon, maybe losing 10% isn't going to have much of an effect. You're certainly going to lose individuals, and here we're not measuring the abundance of total birds, but it seems like at least the community of who is present there is going to be more affected at the smaller end there. An interesting aside here, this is 15 years of data that I'm showing you right now. After I showed you that thing about beta diversity and things changing a lot from year to year and site to site, we decided to look at this for just a single year as well. So we did 2013 for this, just looked at a single year of data. And I'm not even going to bother to show it. The plot looks nearly identical. It turns out that this phenomenon here seems to be pretty robust when looking at just a single year of data or across all the years of data. We also did the same thing for the entire bird community as well. So this here is just birds associated with riparian. If we scale up to the whole bird community, now we're looking at like 80+ species, really similar effect here as well. So this seems to be a robust relationship between how much riparian area there is and how many species we have in these canyons when we look at it in a variety of different ways. And then the last thing I want to talk about with this, the last piece of this analysis was looking at what might happen in the future here. So using those NAEP images I showed you with the pink on there for the riparian, we posed these two future scenarios where riparian might be reduced or contracted. And so the first one was, we said, all right, what would happen if every patch of riparian contracted by 1 meter? And by contracted by a meter, what I mean is, say you took a belt of 1 meter wide and stretched it all the way around the perimeter and took it away. Because that's how it's probably going to disappear. It's going to disappear around the edges and contract. So we said, what if in our entire study system, every riparian patch contracted by 1 meter? It's not much, 3 feet around the whole edge of every patch. And we did the same thing for 5 meters, maybe a more substantial loss of riparian. And then after we did this to these maps, we again calculated how much riparian area, how much fragmentation, because that's going to interact a little bit with fragmentation. We put those through our model to give some predictions of how that would change the bird species present in these canyons. And probably not surprising from the results I've shown so far, those moderate riparian canyons, so those canyons in the like 20 to 30 hectare of riparian zone, right as that curve starting to fall off that I showed you a moment ago, they were expected to experience some pretty substantial declines in how many species are present, anywhere from 7 to 22% species lost in those canyons if we see 1 to 5 meter contraction of riparian areas. So this suggests that in a warmer and drier future, if we do continue to lose riparian in this system, a lot of these canyons may lose a substantial portion of their bird diversity. And again, those big canyons with a lot of riparian, they really don't lose anything, at least under our model. They'll certainly lose individual birds, but they probably have a bit of a buffer there to actually losing any species. Okay, so some just take-home messages for as I wrap up here in my last couple slides. First of all, back to the turnover thing. This system has a lot of turnover. There's a lot of turnover in time and space. We do not understand the mechanisms that drive this. Some of it might be entirely random. I think there's opportunities for some future studies to understand that. But this does pose a challenge, both if we want to study these communities for effectively studying them and also for monitoring them. If we want to see if under future scenarios of climate change, we're losing more species, we need to have an effective way to make sure we understand what's going on there. And so I think this is just a cautionary tale that there's a lot of dynamic stuff happening in the system and things change a lot. How do you effectively monitor when that's the case, if you're trying to see if climate change affects your birds? And then we did have support for the so-called habitat amount hypothesis. More riparian means larger bird communities, and it really seemed like it didn't matter all that much how it was fragmented. If it was in big chunks or scattered all over the canyon, that didn't seem to affect, at least in our system, the number of bird species. Again, I'll throw a caveat out there. Nature's dynamic. Things are always changing. If we have future climate change, those patterns could change. So I don't think this is not the be all end all. We can't apply this to every system around the world. We can't completely ignore fragmentation, but this is an interesting finding, at least for this system in the Great Basin over these 15 years that we were studying. It doesn't seem to have a huge effect there. And then I think the cool thing is that pattern that we found of area but not fragmentation really held up consistently. It held up consistently across time, across different spatial scales, across different mountain ranges, even though we know that those communities have a lot of turnover in composition. So we learned something here about some of the controls on the total size of the communities, how many species are there, even if predicting exactly which species are in those communities is much harder to do. So an interesting nuance there. And I think that comes full circle to my beginning point when I first introduced birds in the Great Basin and told you I wasn't going to talk about individual species of conservation concern or unique endemics. I was going to talk about communities as a whole, this focus on communities rather than individual species. If we think these Great Basin riparian communities are unique, if we want to conserve the most diversity that we can in the most places, our data suggests that a good place to start is focusing on total riparian habitat and maybe not worrying quite as much about its configuration, and maybe focusing on those smaller to moderate sized riparian canyons as the ones with the most bang for the buck in terms of being able to either stop loss or with restoration, maybe even bring back some additional bird species. Okay, with that, I will wrap up. Before I open up for questions and see if we have any in the chat, I've got to thank my collaborators, Erica Fleischman, Martha Zillig, John Yen, Rahel Solman, Allison Key. They were all co-authors on at least something that I presented today. A lot of this stuff I was working on when I was at Davis and finishing up after I left Davis, but Yolo County and Davis are near and dear to my heart. I hope to be back soon. And as I said, I'm now a professor at Cal Poly Humboldt. My contact info is there in case you think of another question that you don't get to today. But with that, thank you all so much for coming out and inviting me back to present for YOLO Audubon. And I can maybe start out with looking at the first questions in the chat here, and then we can do some more. And I can also figure out how to take them from folks who are there live as well. So,
all right,
yeah.
thank you, Frank.
Yeah.
We've got a couple of questions here in the chat.
Yeah. Do you want me to read them or you want to read them, Ken?
Yeah, if that's okay with you. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Dale asks, were all these sites on public land? Differences noted between the sites with permanent water versus those with waterways that dry out in the summer? It's a great question. This was all public land. Nevada has the highest percentage of public land of any state in the US. And so this was all nearly all either BLM or Forest Service land. As far as permanent water versus waterways that dry out in the summer, that's a great question. Most of these systems that we're looking at have a lot of perennial creeks, at least in the bottom of the canyons, but especially with human water diversion, we are seeing some of them start to dry out in summers versus others. I think that it's definitely reflected in the amount of riparian that is present there, but that would be an interesting thing. We didn't delineate between places that had permanent surface water and didn't. The other thing is that changes a lot year to year. In really wet years, some of those, maybe all those canyons might have water, and in really dry years, some of them, the surface flow may stop. All right. And then Genevieve asked, are these study areas subject to development pressure or loss of water from proposed development, or is the greatest concern climate impacts over time? Yeah, development pressure isn't as much of an issue in this area, at least right now. It's pretty remote where we're working. That said, there is demand for water. The entire West is looking for water. There have been schemes by LA to run pipelines, which is thousands of miles up there to take water from some of these tiny little streams and aggregate it together. So there's always the risk of something crazy like that happening to try to take water out of these remote regions. But at least in terms of like suburbs and things going up, they're far away from any urban centers. So that's not probably a huge concern there. We don't know what's happening with climate in riparian area. One of the follow-up projects that we're trying to get off the ground now is actually trying to examine how much riparian areas have been changing over the last few decades in this area. And we're not entirely certain they've been diminishing because there have been some changes in the way that humans interact with the landscape. And in some cases, we may have actually seen riparian areas expand a little bit in the last few decades, but that's just a hunch at this point. That expansion might stop, though, as we get more climate change. And then Dale asked, did you do any banding, determine if the same individuals returned to the same canyons? Speak a little bit more about the data collection methods. So for any of this work I'm talking about now, this was all derived from point count data. Yeah, so it would be really cool to know if that turnover is being driven by different individuals showing up, how much site fidelity is there returning from the same individuals. That would have been an enormous effort to do for the type of spatial scale that we were talking about. That said, we are actively now working on a much smaller scale effort to track elevational movement of individual birds in these canyons using telemetry. So actually being able to get fine location data on where these birds are and related to how they're moving around both within a given year and across years. So we're hoping to untangle a little bit more of this puzzle with that, but that's still kind of in its early stages right now. So yeah, this was all professional point counters doing 3 repeat visits every year, using some methods to account for imperfect detection there to try to get at the best estimate we could as to what was actually present in a given year. But not perfect. No field methods are ever perfect for that sort of thing.
Okay, there's one more in there.
Yeah, and then Sherry said if these are all migratory birds, is the timing of their presence related to seasonal water changes? Probably, yeah. We certainly see at some higher elevations when it's really snowy that affects the ability of these birds, and it'll actually kick around their timing from year to year and when they're able to get into their nesting grounds. We do get a lot of snow in these places and in some really high elevation sites. And they've probably evolved to respond to the availability of water, probably more so how the plants are responding to the water there. But I think they've certainly evolved along that, or they've evolved to respond to that. And this is something that could be an issue in the future if those seasonal changes are changing faster than the birds are able to compensate for them and to adjust to those changes. Even if the amount of water doesn't change, there's a great point here. If when that water becomes available, when snow melt is occurring, when peak flows are occurring, might be changing as well. And that whole phenology and timing thing there, I think, is a really interesting thing to look at and something that we're really fascinated in studying, but is a hard thing to do, and we haven't got anything off the ground with that yet.
Oh, thank you, Frank.
Yeah.
Any questions there in person? Okay, sir.
So I know that you mentioned that there is no effect of habitat fragmentation on species richness in the study area, but did you see a change in community composition?
Okay, I don't know. Did you hear that?
Yeah, I was able to hear it okay. Yeah. So no, we did not find, I didn't talk too much about that. I mentioned a little briefly, but when we were doing that work on the beta diversity, we actually, that was another really surprising finding that I didn't really have time to get into today, but I'm glad you asked. We were not able to really find any of the environmental variables that we looked at as predictors that associated with those differences in the community composition. And one of the things that we did look at was riparian area and some measures of riparian area. And yeah, it didn't seem to interact with it in any sort of predictable way. So it's kind of mind-blowing that it seems to predict the size of the communities quite well, but not who's actually there.
Okay, any other questions? Going once? Okay. Hey, Frank, there are no more questions here in person. And so thank you very much for taking the time to tell us about, oh man, the Great Basin and your work there. It's pretty cool, but I like how you looked at the populations or communities rather than individual birds, because that gives you, I think gives me a bigger picture of the impacts on the avians species there. So anyway, thank you very much. And I'll probably be contacting you in the future as your work progresses. Lewis's woodpecker work sounds pretty interesting.
Yeah, hopefully we'll have some cool results in the coming months and year on that. I've got my first grad student finishing up a project there, but yeah, lots of cool unrelated stuff to what I talked about today, fire and birds and some cool habitat stuff.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Last time. Okay.
All right. Thanks so much, Ken. Thanks, everyone.
Way to go, Frank. Thank you. Let's see. Recording stopped. Bingo. Alrighty.